Hello and welcome. I am Sue Ann Caulfield. I'm the Associate Director of the Donia Center for Human Rights. And I'm really pleased to be welcoming here Jennifer Rosenbaum, Executive Director of the Global Labor Justice. And she will be, she's our featured speaker in this panel on labor and human rights. I wanted to just say a quick word about the Donia Center. The Donia Center was established with a generous donation from Bob and Jane Donia to support human rights very broadly at the University of Michigan. We organize a variety of public events such as this one, support a number of student fellowships, undergraduate and graduate fellowships and internships around the world focused on human rights. And we also host the Raoul Wallenberg Human Rights Prize, and we just announced the establishment of the Raoul Wallenberg Human Rights Practitioner Fellowship that we're aiming to begin with our first fellow next year, and that's a semester-long fellowship for a mid-career practitioner of human rights. And before I get started, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm not going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce our co-chairs of this event. But first, I want to thank Wes Wright, who is in the back, who has done all of the behind-scenes work to put this program together, as well as all of our Donia Center programs. He also runs our student fellowships and awards administration. And we're especially pleased to be partnering for this event today with the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights. And we have with us two members of the committee. Via Zoom, we have Professor Ravi Anupindi. I think he will appear. There he is. Hi, Ravi. Hello, Ravi, and welcome. Ravi Anupindi is Colonel William G. and Ann C. Schletlitz Professor of Operations Research and Management at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business here at U of M. And he's chair of the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights. He's been the chair since 2013. He's a member of several national boards in the areas of supply chain risk, global health, and labor, including the boards of global health of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the Fair Labor Association, and Every Infant Matters Partners. And we have in person Professor Leila Kawar, who will chair our event. Professor Kawar is Associate Professor in the Department of American Culture and in the Residential College Program in Social Theory and Practice. Her socio-legal research focuses on the politics of migration, citizenship, and labor. And her first book, Contesting Immigration Policy in Court, explored the trajectories of the professional field of immigrant rights legal activism in the United States and in France comparatively. Excuse me. Her current research examines the International Labor Organization's historical involvement with guest worker issues. And at U of M, she's a member of the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights. So I will give the floor to the co-chairs, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you, Sue Ann, for this kind introduction. And I would like to really, on behalf of the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights, welcome J.J. Rosenbaum to this event. I really appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to come share your insights on labor and human rights here. I sincerely apologize for not being able to be there in person. Just last week, I had a severe injury and had a fracture in my pelvis, and I'm unable to move out of home. I'm comfortable sitting and talking to you. I'm not in pain, but I cannot travel much, so my apologies. I would like to take a few minutes just to talk to you about the committee that I chair. So this is a mouthful, PACLSHR. This was set up actually 25 years ago. So it happens to be our 25th anniversary. So around the time the FLA was set up by the then President Lee Bollinger to really focus on how universities can uphold labor standards and human rights in the production of primarily licensed goods. So anything that gets the Michigan logo, we as a university are licensing our brand. So this standing committee was set up with 4 faculty members, 3 staff members, and 3 student members to advise the president on these labor standard human rights issues, particularly with a particular focus on licensing. And the way we do our work there is we don't have capacity to monitor supply chains ourselves as universities. We work with the Fair Labor Association as well as the Workers' Rights Consortium, and many universities do. But beyond while that is the core charge given by the president to our committee, the charge includes more broadly education and research around labor standards and human rights, not necessarily connected to licensing. So what we do on that front basically is during the semester, we support student researchers on topics that are of interest of the committee members or the broader community. And every year, at least one semester, we do a project with the student groups. We also have been, for the past several years, working with the Fair Labor Association and in partnership with the Dania Center to sponsor 2 interns to the FLA working on FLA's mission. We also support, during the summer, international travel fellowships. These are students, graduate students who can submit a proposal about what kind of area they want to investigate as either part of their dissertation if they're doctoral students or otherwise. And we select 2 students and we support their travel, et cetera, and living expenses. So, the committee actually is more broader than simply the upholding of licensing. And I would like to say, I think, not because I interact with other universities as well, I think our committee is unique in the sense that we have a direct reporting line to the president, and we are able to bring any of these issues on campus around these issues with the president. And even in the 25 years with multiple leadership changes, every president is very committed to this issue and cares about the labor standards, human rights issues on campus. Some of the work that we have done using research assistants here is to begin to look into food procurement at the university and to ensure how we think about honoring labor standards in the food procurement. Parallelly, the university is also looking at food procurement from the carbon neutrality lens. So hopefully we hope that the university will move towards more holistic approach to food procurement on campus. So with that basic introduction, once again, I'd like to welcome JJ Rosenbaum. But before I do that, more formally, I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Laila Kawar, to formally introduce JJ before her talk. So Laila, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. So as Ravi mentioned, this is the 25th anniversary year of the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights. And we were talking over the summer about what type of thing we could do to commemorate the work the committee has done and kind of synthesize it in its different strands. And we decided that this event would manage to do that difficult thing, because as the committee is involved in educational work, in the licensing work, and now branching off into new sectors, it's hard to tie it together. But I think our speaker today will do that. JJ Rosenbaum is an attorney, but also an organizer and a human rights strategist, advocating for human rights, decent work for all, and fair migration. She's built a successful record of advocacy work that spans the world of law and policy, working with corporate leaders in the world of business and human rights, with development finance institutions on investor ESG due diligence, through the American Bar Association on human trafficking policy matters, and with leaders of U.S. organized labor to engage the U.S. Congress on labor and human rights issues in trade policy. She's also worked, however, with local organizers at worker centers in New Orleans and elsewhere to obtain remedies and develop systemic solutions for exploitation of migrant workers in the United States. And she has worked with trade unions in the Global South, most notably as co-signatory to an agreement that has achieved major improvements in combating workplace gender-based violence and harassment. So she brings a wealth of experience in developing truly creative legal strategies that support building collective power to address inequities and injustices in our global economy. And I'd like to introduce JJ to tell us some of the things that her organization, Global Labor Justice, is doing now, and then we'll have a question and answer, which I hope all of you will contribute to after her presentation. Thank you.
That was a very kind introduction. Thank you. And it's really an honor to be here to help recognize and celebrate 25 years of the President's Advisory Committee, which is seen nationally and people who do this work as a very innovative and important structure that has stood the test of time. And I think we're at a moment where we're checking and investigating lots of different structures and figuring out what structures can help us really advance labor rights, irrespective of national borders and gender and race and caste and all these other things. And as students who go to the university, it's really great that you have such a strong SILS chapter. If you don't know what that is, who here is from SILS can raise their hand and talk to anyone afterwards. Students for International Labor Solidarity. So if you're hearing that for the first time, check these guys out and figure out how you can get involved. This is my first time to visit Ann Arbor, and so I'm really, it's really an honor to be here. I think there's a lot of interwoven paths of dear friends and colleagues that some Layla and I were just talking about. As well as I have to say that when I think of Ann Arbor, I think back to the Signal International campaign, which was when I was working in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and 500 workers from India were trafficked on H-2B guest worker visas to build oil rigs and other structures on the Gulf Coast. And we helped them organize and advocate and in many ways reframe both what was possible to demand as a guest worker at the time and also how to understand the interrelation of migration and forced labor. But a big part of the work was communicating in the languages Malayalam, Telugu, and Tamil, none of which I speak or the majority of the people on our team. And there were, in my mind, hundreds of aunties from the Ann Arbor area that would be on calls very late at night on the weekends, helping us have authentic communications with these workers at a time when they were very precarious, very much at risk, before their campaigns started to win, before books have been written and trials have been won, when they were really sharing what happened to them, and that was being received in a graceful and kind and authentic way so that communications could happen. And so I've always thought I should come to Ann Arbor and make a blanket thank you to these mostly women who did this volunteer work. And it struck me particularly at this time where we're all we may be feeling a little bit under-resourced, underprepared for the challenges ahead, and unsure like what we can each show up with, that this really reminds me everyone has something to contribute to the vision of your community and your university and your world. If you are willing to make some time late at night and on the weekends and show up and start. And I definitely, this fierce organizing campaign and multi-layered legal strategy wouldn't have happened without all of this collegial work. Maybe some of your moms and aunts and sisters actually were doing this and you don't even know. So So thank you to them. I really want to thank particularly Dr. Ravi Anapindi and Professor Leila for the invitation and the gracious hospitality for being here and the invitation to talk about these important issues. There are a lot of experts in the room, and so I'm coming to tell you a little bit about how we are trying to do this work at Global Labor Justice. Some of the work that I talk about, almost all of it is co-created with an ecosystem of organizations and partners. It's part of how we do our work. And so in the garment sector work, we work with the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, which is a global South. It's the only global South-led network of unions and workers' rights organizations in a particular sector. 20 years ago, they were piloting how to respond to the idea of capital moving across borders and making countries compete against each other, particularly on the basis of wage. And so they set out to develop a living wage strategy based on learnings from the national law in the countries where garments were largely being produced. And that alliance has held now for almost 30 years and informs much of the strategy, not only in the garment sector, but in many other sectors as well. And then they have affiliate unions that represent garment workers directly in democratic union structures. And so it's much easier for me to be here with you in Michigan. But many of the things that I talk about are not work that I'm doing by myself or doing at all. We're going to try to bring a few of the voices of workers themselves. But a big part of thinking about how we build social justice strategies across borders that capital and products and trade are moving across is how we build authentic organizational ecosystems that really recognize the strategy and the leadership of organizations in the Global South, and that recognize the authentic importance of democratic worker organizations and the decision-making that they should have, even when it takes a village or a set of allies like Global Labor Justice to build research and build strategy and collaborate together. The question is, so we start out with what is the problem? And so one way to talk about what the problem is for workers that make the clothes that many of us are wearing today, that make the clothes that bear the Michigan logo, is to look at the question of wages. And so this slide shows you the monthly minimum wages for 3 major garment producing countries and the percentage of the minimum living wage that presents. And then also a little bit, the International Trade Union Confederation does a report every year on freedom of association rights, so we have some quotes from that. I do want to emphasize wages are not the end-all be-all, and you have an expert among you from the Leadership Center here who's doing some very interesting and important theorizing of how to look at dignity and the importance that the opposites of precarity and dignity play in understanding work. But it's also minimum living wage is what it takes for you to eat food and live in a house and go to the doctor if you're sick and send your kids to school. And so if you're at a sub minimum living wage, it represents a different kind of crisis and precarity that workers are always living in. And that really is the garment sector right now. This represents quite a lot of workers. The garment sector employs 40 million workers, and Asia accounts for about 60% of global garment exports. Women also constitute more than half of the garment sector workforce in Asia and are disproportionately represented in the lowest wage jobs and in the lowest tiers of that sector. And so as we think about strategies to reform the sector, we have to fundamentally center gender and the agency of women workers. And the industry has been fundamentally built on a model of gaining a competitive advantage by moving to countries with the lowest wages and social costs, and have this held in place by inequality of countries and gendered industrial relations. The garment sector global supply chain model is in some ways what many other sectors are aspiring to, but garment has been piloting it for a much longer time. That's why it's interesting to talk about. But it's also interesting to talk about because garment workers have been organizing at the national, regional, and global level. They have been leading on strategies and have won important things, and they are in many ways at the center of a global labor movement that's trying to respond to a changing economy. So I wanted to introduce Nisa. This is just a short clip. She's a worker in Indonesia. She's a member of the union SPN, which is an important garment worker union in Indonesia. And this is just a short clip of how she expresses what the problem is and what the solution is.
Saya Nisa, 35 tahun, sudah 7 tahun bekerja di perusahaan Taekwang Group asal Korea Selatan yang merupakan pemasok utama produk sepatu Nike di daerah tempat saya tinggal saat ini dengan status sebagai pekerja tetap. Untuk memenuhi biaya hidup, saya dan suami terpaksa meminjam kepada saudara dan bank dengan menjaminkan aset milik kami sebagai agunan. Hingga saat ini, saya masih harus membayar utang yang telah saya dapatkan dan menebus aset yang telah saya agunkan. Saya menilai bahwa Nike harus bertanggung jawab atas hak upah saya dan pekerja lainnya karena pekerja telah menghasilkan produk dengan kualitas tinggi untuk mendapatkan harga jual yang mahal kepada konsumen. Maka sudah seharusnya pekerja mendapatkan upah yang cukup dan berada pada taraf standar hidup yang layak yang didapatkan dari imbal balik keuntungan perusahaan Nike yang besar yang dimana produksinya berada di mana-mana. Karena kan yang seperti sering kita dengar ya Pak, kalau misalnya Nike itu kan menggadang-gadangkan tentang kesetaraan, ya sudah pastinya kita sebagai pekerjanya yang memberikan produk yang terbaik ya sudah semestinya kita mendapatkan hal-hal demikian. Menurut saya sih kayak gitu Pak, bergabung ya pekerja perempuan memberikan kekuatan untuk mendorong perubahan di mana tujuan kita adalah kesejahteraan dan kehidupan yang berkelanjutan. Dengan bersama pasti akan terwujud dengan bergabung dengan kami para perempuan yang kuat, perempuan yang berani menghadapi dan melawan ketidakadilan. Maka bergabung dengan kami.
We're in a university with a lot of textbooks and PowerPoints, but I wanted to share a little bit about how the workers themselves are having these conversations, and they've developed a way of doing this around that using a kilogram of rice. And so this is the Sri Lanka example of how workers are talking to each other. The first you see like what represents the wages that a worker gets, and that's calculated at 1 grain of rice. Then assuming 1 grain of rice is equal to that worker's monthly salary, which is about $100 per month in Sri Lanka, how much would a supervisor make? So a supervisor makes, it turns out, about 3 grains of rice. You can barely see them there on the PowerPoint. A manager makes about 12 grains of rice. You get to the CEO of the largest Nike supplying factory in Sri Lanka. You're starting to see a little pile there, right? And then you look at the Nike CEO on the right, and there's not enough rice in the bag to represent that. You need over 24,000 grains of rice. So we started, this is how we started talking about it with workers, and they start talking to each other about it. And then we realized that we were missing one little Post-it, one little measurement. And it turns out if you zoom out even farther and look at the financial transactions that the shareholders in the company are benefiting from, the dividends paid to investors in Nike in 2023, you'd need 60 bags of rice to compare the amount of money that went back into those dividends and those stock buybacks. So this helps us answer the first question of sort of, is there enough, who's benefiting from the current definition? If you think as an organizer, you think like who's benefiting and who's losing under the current rules of the system. It's clear that the workers compared to the shareholders are vastly, extremely different. In GLJ, we're working on sort of an analysis that makes sure that we connect both the labor supply chain or the labor market analysis, the product supply chain and the tiers of production, and also the financial extraction around that. So Professor Jennifer Gordon calls that the human supply chain. But I think as the premise of this lecture, it's really important that we're understanding migration and how people are moving from where they start out to where they're working, as well as understanding how the shirt that gets made starts from the fabric all the way up to the dividends being paid to shareholders. And that at Global Labor Justice, that's our theory, that this is descriptive in many ways. But breaking this down helps us understand social change strategies that will help us give workers more agency, more rights, and a greater ownership over their own workplace. It's also important, I think, when we talk about the money, to note the amount of money that money making makes and how this is fundamentally changing the nature of the economy. And so the gray dot that you see throughout those circles is the GDP. And the green around it are the financial transactions going on all around it. And so we're seeing just an extraction of resources fundamentally not only from workers, but from all the goods and services in a country, and the money that's making stuff versus the money that's making money. This is not a surprise. I assume you all may have different ways of talking about it than rice or circles and charts. But these are just some recent articles that have been in the common papers in the last couple of years. How can a garment be cheaper than a sandwich? The sort of understanding of the situation as apocalyptic during the pandemic for workers. And I don't think this is an exaggeration. This really was the experience of many workers as they shared it with us. Another way that this is being discussed is the Global South discount. So again, how do you make countries compete against each other, largely based off the costs of workers? And you can see that within a country. You can see this as the Teamsters organizing, or sorry, the UAW organizing director talking about the Alabama discount. And then you see the Global South discount more broadly. And that's, I think, why we have to understand that the global supply chain model, there may be abuse by individual bad actors in a particular situation, but the structure of a global supply chain is meant to decrease the labor costs fundamentally. And that means, again, moving people to where the jobs are, moving the jobs to where the wages are the lowest and the regulation is the lowest, the health and safety, the environmental regulation, and extracting all of that value out up the top. Now, our current ways of thinking about strategy around this are somewhat limited because they're often around national borders. So you see here the workers in their factory may be in a particular country. They may be in Thailand. You may have workers in a factory that didn't get paid. And the argument is they should fight with the Thai government, or they should file a case, or they should organize a collective bargaining agreement with that supplier and those workers in that country. Employment law, or if there's any law students here, employment law is national law, right? Labor law is national law. And then you cross a border and you get to the buyer. In garment, we sometimes call it the brand buyer, the entity that's gonna take the thing that's made. And then you're all of a sudden in a different country under a different kind of law. You're under the commercial law of contracts, and the labor law is not supposed to connect. And the kind of way that you might advocate on a brand, or the shareholders, who are up in the galaxy somewhere, if the workers are on the ground, is talked about in principle, the Ruggie principles, not the law, right? And certainly not employment law or joint employer, or some of these very fundamental principles, which say if you are responsible for setting up the system for your commercial benefit, you're also responsible for making sure that the workers in that system get their fundamental wages, health and safety rights, et cetera. A lot of the early fights that happened around that by garment workers, by farm workers in the national level in the United States got broken when this work moved, simply by moving it to another country and saying, okay, this is no longer an employment law question anymore. There have been different strategies legally to try to figure out how this works. Many companies have what they call codes of conduct. They say on their website, we promise to follow the ILO's fundamental labor rights, or we promise to do our business in a certain ethical way. But those are fundamentally voluntary. And so that has been found to sometimes reflect the consensus that can be built by active campaigning and advocacy, but it's not enforceable or accountable by anyone outside the company. And oftentimes it's not followed. It's not followed by the entities that have these kind of statements on their website. So workers have found this to be insufficient in terms of resolving very fundamental workplace problems. There is what's called the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct for multinational corporations. This is a voluntary system. It is a place where workers collectively, if there have been a violation of certain kinds of human and labor rights, can go and ask for a mediation. But it's a voluntary process, so it only works if the multinational employer or investor agrees to the mediation and agrees to come. If not, then it can't move forward. So, hey, big multinational enterprise, you should talk to the union, right? Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes good offices, sometimes what's missing is the right kind of forum to have a conversation. We can all imagine this in context of our lives, but if it's a huge power dynamic, if it's a recalcitrant party, then that's not gonna be necessarily sufficient enough. But it does offer an opportunity. It's certainly not a court. It's not like you can say my minimum wages weren't paid and I'm gonna go there and some independent arbiter is gonna order the wages to be paid. And then there's been a lot of experimentation around different kinds of legal regulation. And you can see, do we have any law students in the room? One, all right, good for you. As happens, you see a lot of different kinds of competing regulations. Some of them are in the human trafficking lane. Some of them are in what's called due diligence lane. So they're at the national level, at the regional level. Some of them are more about reporting, like tell us what you're doing as a company. Some of them are about creating obligations. This is still emerging, and so nothing has seemed immediately to be completely sufficient, but I think there's a lot of experimentation going on with lawyers and unions and worker organizations that are trying to figure out if some of these laws can be used and can fill the gap between what happens. So the question is, what's the way forward? What is working? What are groups like Global Labor Justice and others like ours figuring out? I think the first thing I'll say is what I said at the beginning, that this is not a one organization kind of fight for more equality in the global economy. It requires worker organizations and their members who are fundamentally sitting in the workplace where work is happening and fighting for dignity and rights every single day. It requires regional organizations and sectoral-based organizations that know really well, okay, this is how the work is happening. These are the changes that could be made. This is where the money is that could be over here that could come back to the workers. And then it requires some additional kinds of strategy and research and support and organizations in the country where the brand buyers and the investors are. So you need organizations in the country where the workers are. You need organizations in the region where the labor market is broadly across many countries. You need workers in the place where the consumer markets are and where the commercial markets are. Historically, that was understood as north-south, but that is definitely not the case anymore. We see capital vastly moving, across Asia. We see consumer bases rising in Asia and Latin America, and multinational brands being very concerned about their reputational standing beyond just in the United States or Europe. But I think those are the kind of categories that we think about. And if we look at it that way, you can start to imagine how you might link together across that very simple original diagram, which had workers and a direct employer without much power on one side and brands and investors on another. And so I want to talk about a specific example that is pretty interesting. But before that, just also to say, when you start to imagine the map more structurally, you can start to see the laws, not only these laws that are emerging, not only as a chance for individual accountability, but as a risk assessment by multinational companies that will change their behavior in a preventative way. So it's one thing if I have a multinational, if I'm Nike and I think, and I don't do anything and there's rampant sexual harassment on my supply chain, and then someone tries to come with the workers and say, we've been sexually harassed, how do we get a remedy? How do we solve this problem? What we think is much preferable is if the problem is prevented to begin with. And so if some of these laws can serve to change the risk assessment of multinational corporations in a way that drives forward prevention with a worker agency perspective, that would be a lot better. And that's different work as a lawyer, so it's pretty interesting and fun. I'm glad to talk to anyone afterwards about that. So the Dindigul Agreement to eliminate GBVH was signed in 2022. It has stakeholders from the union in Dindigul. Dindigul is in the south of the state of Tamil Nadu in the country of India, in the region of Asia. And it came after a very militant and fierce campaign led by the TTCU, the union in India supported by allies around the world, after the death of a young garment worker who was being abused by her supervisor at work. And in the face of that tragedy, the workers at the plant and the members of TTCU came together and said, we want to not only honor her death and compensate her family, but we want this not to happen again. We want a structural solution. We want to change the practice, and we want to be a model all around the globe. And so the Dindigul Agreement to eliminate gender-based violence and harassment is the first enforceable supply chain agreement in Asia, which again is where 60% of the garments are made. This is just a little bit of an example of what it looks like when in some of the meetings surrounding the agreement. This is Divya Rekini, the president of TTCU. You can see her back. And then I again have a short video of Vineswari talking a little bit about what the agreement has meant and how it has changed the practices in the workplace day to day and the role that shop floor monitors are playing. The Dindigul Agreement doesn't create a separate NGO. It doesn't give me a lot of work in Washington, D.C. The fundamental premise, which is similar to a lot of the ways that organizers think, is to build the agency and collective power of women workers in the workplace, structure around their work. This is called the Safe Circles methodology, which was developed by the Asia Floor Wage Alliance. And so it's a 20-to-1 ratio of train the trainers. If workers on a particular line have a problem, or sometimes it's centered around the hostel or the transportation, they have a problem, they bring it to the shop floor monitor. The shop floor monitor tries to resolve it with the offending supervisor. If that can't be resolved, it goes to a union management meeting. If it can't be resolved there, it can go up the chain eventually to what's called the Oversight Committee, which has people from the United States and the brands. But thus far, no issues have come there because they are actually, the power dynamic is changing on the shop floor. And that's really the goal of these kinds of agreements. The nature of the agreement is that certain things have to happen in the workplace between the workers and the direct employer, the garment factory. And if those things happen, then more business should flow from the multinational brands, from Gap, H&M, Calvin Klein. On the other hand, if the factory doesn't support and follow the rules, then there could be business consequences. That's the idea of an enforceable brand agreement, is that the buying power is connected to the conditions in the workplace. So let's hear from Vineswari.
இந்த திண்டுக்கல் அக்ரிமெண்ட் வந்ததுக்கு அப்புறம் எங்களுக்கு சாஃப்ட் ஃப்ளோர் மானிட்டர்னு ஒரு பொறுப்பு வந்து எங்களுக்கு கொடுத்துருக்குறாங்க. லைனில் எந்த பிரச்சனை நடந்தாலும், ஃபேக்ட்ரிக்குள்ள எங்கள் டிபார்ட்மெண்ட்டில் எந்த ஒரு பிரச்சனை நடந்தாலும் அதை போய் நாங்களே போய் சால்வ் பண்ணுற மாதிரி வந்து எங்களுக்கு வந்து ஒரு தைரியம் இருக்குது. அதுக்கப்புறம் ஏதாவது இப்போ லேடிஸ்க்கு இப்போ ஏதாவது பிரச்சனைனா, ஏதாவது சூப்பர்வைசர் ஏதாவது சொல்லிட்டாங்க வச்சுட்டாங்கன்னா அவங்க வந்து எங்ககிட்ட தைரியமாக சொல்லுவாங்க. சாஃப்ட் ஃப்ளோர் மானிட்டர் அவங்க இருக்கிறாங்க, அவங்ககிட்ட சொன்னால் நம்மளோட ப்ராப்ளம் வந்து சால்வ் ஆகும் அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு தைரியம் வந்து அவங்களுக்கு இருக்குது. அந்த இடத்துல தப்பு நடந்தால் அதை தட்டி கேட்குற தைரியமும் எங்களுக்கு இருக்குது. ஃபஸ்ட்டெல்லாம் கச்சாருக்கு வரணுமா இல்லை இந்த பிரச்சனை நம்ம கொண்டு போய் சொல்லணுமா, நம்ம போய் சொன்னோம்னா நம்ம வேலைக்கு ஏதாவது பிரச்சனை ஆயிருமோ, இல்லை நம்ம பேரை வச்சு வேறு ஏதாவது பிரச்சனை ஆயிருமோ சொல்லி நாங்கள் பயந்துக்கிட்டு எங்கள் பிரச்சனையை வந்து நாங்கள் எங்களுக்குள்ளேயே நாங்கள் மூடி மறைச்சு நாங்கள் அப்படியே நாங்கள் வேலையை பார்க்க ஆரம்பிச்சிடுவோம். ஆனால் இப்போ இந்த திண்டுக்கல் அக்ரிமெண்ட் அதுக்கப்புறம் வந்ததுக்கப்புறம் நாங்கள் ஹச்ஆராக இருந்தாலுமே வெல்ஃபேராக இருந்தாலுமே நாங்களே தைரியமாக போய் பேசுகிற அளவுக்கு வந்து எங்களுக்கு வந்து தைரியம் கொடுத்துருக்குறாங்க. எங்களுக்கான இந்த சாஃப்ட்வேர் மானிட்டர் இந்த பொறுப்பை கொடுத்ததுக்கப்புறம் எங்களுக்கான உரிமையை வந்து நாங்கள் தெரிஞ்சுக்கிட்டோம்.
डिडिगल एग्रीमेंट पूर्वरु आमମାନଙ୍କୁ ए प्रकार फैसिलिटी थिला कि जे आगो डिडिगल एग्रीमेंट पूर्वरु आमମାନଙ୍କୁ कोनोसी भाबरे फ्रीडम मिलु नथिला, जहा कि आमे मासकु थरे केवल मात्र सैलरी परे ही आमे टोकन हिसाब रे जाके नाम लेखुतिलु 100 जन पिला हेले गोटे बस अरेंज होतिला, तापरे आमे जाय कि किंतु एबे हमको फ्रीडम अनुसार सैलरी परे हो कि जते बेले भी हो हमको मासकु मास थरे एमती नियंती नाही। एबे डिडिगल एग्रीमेंट परे हमको सप्ताह रे प्रति संडे रे हमको जते बेले इच्छा लागबो सेते बेले हमें आगो आम सैलरी रु हमको खाइबा खाद्यटा कटा जाउतिला, किंतु एबे चार्जिंग टा डिडिगल एग्रीमेंट परे हमर चार्जिंग फीस टा एबे हमर कटा जाउ नाही, जा कि जे एडा हम पे गोटे बहुत भलो विषय अटे।
So I think for us, we're now 2 years into the implementation of this agreement, and the Global Labor Institute at Cornell University put out a report earlier this year analyzing some of the data. And I think what it showed was that the Dindigul Agreement has been effective at responding to and moving towards the prevention of gender-based violence and harassment as defined by the ILO and Convention 190, but also at addressing migration and migrant discrimination, as the shop floor monitor there was discussing, as well as caste discrimination, and that unlike many corporate social responsibility or training programs, it's one of the only programs fundamentally with an accountable grievance mechanism. And that the centering of freedom of association and the right to join unions and the protection from retaliation is ultimately what has been central to that, as well as the centering of worker agency in the responding to disputes. So this is not an agreement that's positing that a brand, a US-based brand or a lawyer from the United States from Global Labor Justice is swooping in to solve the problem, right? This is about changing the power dynamics in the workplace so workers themselves can challenge what's happening day to day. And that is working not only for issues related to gender-based violence and harassment, which were the core of the agreement, but also other issues related to transportation, related to health and safety at work and other things. And that this has led to joint problem solving between workers and the union and the employer and manager. It's led to meaningful remediation. So when there's problems, there's actually solutions. And it's set up an appropriate role back to that diagram. It set up an appropriate role for unions and suppliers and the buyers and the investors and the labor support organizations like Global Labor Justice. And I think, there's a lot of discussion about the positive business case for human rights. I'm sure folks at the university are looking at it and having different discussions. We don't advocate for these issues from the normative position of positive business impact. But fundamentally, the studies showed that there was a positive business impact of the agreement, that there was a decrease in the attrition rate of workers, there was an increase in worker efficiency, there was a decrease in the rejection of quality based on quality control. There was an increase in reporting to work on time. And so where do we go from here? I think, there are now a handful of agreements like the Dindigul Agreement, which we call enforceable brand agreements, linking the purchasing power with fundamental labor rights and centering freedom of association. However, there are not a whole lot of them. We don't yet see that businesses are adequately evaluating the risk of not having the agreements or are adequately valuing the benefit that they're getting from them. And we think that there should be more, and we would love to work with SILS and other organizations on how to expand this. there's a current campaign going on at Global Labor Justice around unpaid pandemic COVID wages for garment workers. And I know that that's been an issue here on campus that many student activists are working on. Our data shows that during the time that workers went unpaid for significant periods of time during COVID, often in violation of national law, the profits for the garment multinationals and their investors reached record levels. That is also measured by incredible stock buybacks. So workers across a set of countries where Asia Floor Wage has chapters have been running a campaign on Nike trying to raise this question of why can't workers be valued? Why is equality, where's the equality that they're often putting in their advertisements? So I just wanted to end quickly with a short video that they made, and then I'm gonna have an ask for anyone that would like to help.
Saya bekerja di pabrik untuk membuat sepatu Nike. Saya membuat sepatu lari Nike.
நான் 2 வருடங்களாக நைக்கி ஆடை உற்பத்தியில் வேலை புரிந்து வருகிறேன்.
Kami melihat Nike suka memakai perempuan kuat itu untuk iklan-iklan mereka.
பந்து வீரர்கள்,
Pemain tenis, seorang pelari,
எங்களுடைய நிலைமை என்ன?
kami juga perempuan kuat.
நாங்கள் கடினமாக உழைக்கின்றோம்.
Sangat keras. Saya bekerja 6 hari dalam 1 minggu.
எப்பொழுதும் கூடுதல் நேரமாக.
Ketika COVID, mereka memotong upah saya harus makan 1 kali sehari. Bahkan, keluarga harus berhutang kemana-mana.
ஒரு நேர உணவு கூட இல்லாமல் நான் பெரிதளவில் பாதிக்கப்பட்டேன்.
Tapi Nike, kamu tetap dapat keuntungan. Kamu tetap menghabiskan jutaan dolar untuk iklan. Ketika kami tidak mendapatkan upah, kami tetap bekerja agar bisa memberikan uang kepada keluarga.
இவ்வளவு நடந்தாலும் நாங்கள் கைவிடவில்லை.
Sama seperti perempuan-perempuan kuat yang ada di iklan-iklanmu.
எங்களுடைய நிலைமை என்ன?
Ayolah Nike, pakai aku di iklanmu. Tampilkan kami di iklanmu.
எங்களை சஞ்சிகளில் போடுங்கள்.
Karena kami perempuan kuat dan kami pejuang. Kami menantangmu Nike.
நைக்கி நாங்கள் உங்களோட சண்டை பிடிக்கிறோம்.
Untuk upah yang layak,
சமத்துவத்திற்காக
untuk upah hidup. Jadi tampilkan kami di iklanmu.
நாங்கள் கேமராவிற்கு தயார்.
Tapi bayar dulu upah kami. Bayar hutang-hutangmu.
அது சரி, முதலில் எங்கள் பணத்தை எங்களிடம் தாருங்கள்.
Workers themselves across South and Southeast Asia and the Asia Floor Wage Alliance countries have been using the rice workshop with each other, and 1,000 workers on Nike's supply chain have come forward with their photographs saying, like, this is a problem we're having, and we want to meet with Nike, and we want this to be resolved. And this is the first time that we're aware of such a public coming forward of workers, and it's an attempt to break the repression and the fear and to stand across borders or across particular factories. Again, this is related to a study done around unpaid COVID wages. So there's a request to allies, which includes all of you, to agree that on a particular day, we're all going to share these 1,000 pictures and demand Nike meet with the workers and discuss next steps. So I've been asked by my team to see if we can get 100 people to agree to do this while I'm here. So if you're savvy, you know how to do the menu, then you can do the QR code. And that'll help you have the social media and you can share it all everywhere. And we really hope that individually with your organizations, et cetera, you know, it's easy to hide from one organization or one university or one brand buyer, but we think that a new day is coming, and the ability of workers to stand together across borders, the strength of women who are demanding a different kind of global supply chain and a different kind of work is really important, and we think Nike has the opportunity to change its position and to do a better job. So please, we're going to count. We have a way inside, so if you can do that, we'd really appreciate it. So I'll just leave it up there. And now I think we're going to have some time for Q&A.
Okay, so thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So Ravi and I are both going to ask a question to begin with, and the idea is that will give everyone here time to think of questions. Okay, so Ravi is going to ask a question. I'll ask a question before him, and then we'll open it up so that all of you can ask the questions that I know you're burning to ask. So I'm going to start with a question that actually came from students in my class who are here. And they were asking, since we're being hosted by the Donia Center for Human Rights, they were thinking, human rights and global labor justice should go together, but often they don't. Is it difficult to explain to the world of human rights? How much interest is there from the human rights community? Maybe you could just talk about your experience with that.
I mean, in my experience among the world of advocates and activists around human rights, there's not a distinction. I mean, people may focus on a particular kind of human rights based on their own experience or their own commitments, but understanding, the lack of living wages, the lack of decent pay and decent work for the work that you're doing is understood as a universal problem and a place that people can come together. I think some of the human rights system has focused more on states, although we know also with the international covenants, there's a covenant on economic and social rights, as well as a covenant on civil and political rights. I think that there's a growing understanding that multinational corporations, many of them have more power than many states, and that many of the solutions coming forward are going to require working across regions and across state and national borders at the social movement level to enable our countries and our states to be the best that they can be. We know that in democracy, the approach towards labor rights and human rights may wax and wane, but for human rights organizations and for people's movements and for unions, we fight forward. We are not taking permission from any state to do what we're doing or not doing. And for people in the United States that are feeling unsure about what to do in this moment, I think there's a lot to be learned from unions and workers' movements in Brazil and in India and in El Salvador, and in Hungary and many countries that have been operating without the support or the sanction, in many cases, the extreme repression of the state. And so I have learned a lot from people that identify in the traditional human rights movement, and I think there's a lot more ground coming forward. The ILO, you may know, has now joined the UN family, but actually predates the United Nations, and so international labor standards have always been there in the ILO world, in addition to the international human rights standards.
Okay, so let me turn it to Ravi to ask a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Laila. Thank you, JJ, for a wonderful, tour of all the work that you're doing and giving very concrete examples. Really appreciate that. So let me, as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about the Dindigul Agreement, but more broadly, enforceable brand agreement. So my question really here is around is, who is enforcing this? It seems like, if I've understood this correctly, that brands came together. So there is some self-enforcement going on between brands. There's no external entity enforcing this. I'm curious to know about how that is structured. And then a follow-up question then is, it seems like it's working. And I know what you just said is that the workers, it's changing the power dynamics in the workplace. So that's a great thing. How do we scale these kinds of initiatives?
Great question. Unsurprisingly, right to the the heart of the matter. So the enforceable brand agreement model has a set of structures, which I can walk through in a little more detail, which probably will make it more legible. So there's the labor management dialogue, which is fundamentally where the problems are attempted to be solved. So you have the shop floor monitors changing power dynamics day by day by day. If that's not happening, it goes to the labor management dialogue. This is sort of industrial relations 101 for those of you that think about labor. So it's not new. It's just that it's been difficult to make this happen because the global supply chain power dynamic changes so intensely what's happening. Now, if that doesn't work, there is an additional structure called the Oversight Committee. Oftentimes that's what it's called, but it's a structure that has the brand buyers, the multinational labor stakeholders like Global Labor Justice, the union, the direct employer, the factory, as well as potentially an independent chair. And that's where issues go if they're not able to be solved. And there are contracts which set some requirements for what brands will do if there is an issue that goes to the Oversight Committee. So the goal is always to work things out and to build consensus and to solve problems. But ultimately, there are enforceable agreements with binding arbitration at the end or national law if the consensus can't work. Again, in the Dindigul agreement thus far, no issue has gone to the Oversight Committee. Like, it has not risen above the factory level. Having those structures in place helps make that happen. I'm not a great sports person, but my colleague Lance Compa calls it baseball style of arbitration, where you set up a situation where the arbitration is unlikely to happen because of the structure.
The other question is, how do we scale these things?
Oh, how do we scale? Yes. I mean, I think scale is coming. I think that for us, it was important to start deep first, to do two things: to go deep and to evaluate. Because our hypothesis was that this was going to work very well, but it's fair to say we need to measure and assess. And the two first enforceable brand agreements around gender-based violence and harassment, the Lesotho Agreement and the Dindigul Agreement, are still less than 5 years old. I think we're very highly encouraged by the evaluations that have been coming out. There'll be another one come out this year. And so the work now is to socialize the evaluations, to socialize what I would call the risk assessment. And I think to that end, it's really encouraging, Ravi, to have the business school involved in this. We need not only the SILs, we need the business school, we need the social sciences school. And I think we need to assess how we will go broad and also stay deep. Because there are many, many broad initiatives in all of these fronts right now. There's, initiatives to do training on gender-based violence and harassment. There's initiatives to help workers learn about Convention 190 on gender-based violence and harassment at the ILO. The workers in the Dindigul factories had some of these trainings. But if that doesn't fundamentally change the power dynamic in the workplace, if it doesn't create agency for women workers themselves, we think it's unlikely to therefore be able to change the pressure that's coming down from global supply chain structures. So I think that's the next question. We're very interested and open to different ways that scale could happen. It could be a broader region-wide or a smaller country. It could be, so it could be a particular brand and all of their supply chain. I do think one thing that where there has to be movement by the multinational buyers is that this is not purely a crisis resolution situation. I think we are still too much in the, workers have to die in order to get movement. And we saw that in Bangladesh in response to Rana Plaza. We saw that with the death of Jayshree Katravel. We hear a lot of rhetoric when I go to meetings with a lot of multinationals or government people who will say, like, workers shouldn't have to die, but then I don't get a lot of follow-up phone calls. And in fact, what we hear is like, okay, if there's enough of an advocacy campaign to show there was a crisis, we can mitigate the crisis. But the gendered industrial relationships and the power imbalance on supply chains is ongoing. It's not going to change fundamentally. It's not a flashpoint crisis. It's a structural problem that has to be constantly negotiated and measured. And so I'm optimistic, and I think there's a lot of work that all of us can do to get towards scale. But I think scale at the scale that doesn't go deep would risk replicating some of the same problems we have with current initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Lila.
Okay, so Wes Wright is in the back with a microphone. If there are some questions, maybe we can take a couple of them at a time, and then if we have time, we'll take another round. And those online who would like to ask a question also have the option to write that into the Q&A, and Ravi can relay them after this first round of questions from the room. So is there a question? I think the microphone is right back there.
Yeah, I have a question. I was interested to see global labor justice fight the heist campaign. I think that's really important. I also think it's important to note that one of such cases is actually implicating the university right now. Workers who produce Michigan apparel had their wages stolen during the pandemic, about $600,000. And our university is the only university, as a result of our committee, to realize that this is a violation of our contract. So I would like to ask you to go into more detail about the importance of universities and, by extension, students in the garment industry and how we work together to ensure labor rights and human rights are upheld with the people who make our clothes.
Great, thank you. Can we take one other question at the same time, just to have a chance for other people? It looks like one over here.
How did you get enough leverage on brands to get them to agree to the Dindigal commitments that they made, and which brands made those commitments?
The question was about leverage over brands in the Dindigal agreement. So.
Great. Well, thank you for flagging the situation going on here at the University of Michigan and the Violet Apparel's case in Thailand. And so, I think that, the University of Michigan is not a big H&M store, right? We're not all just consumers. It's maybe not fully a democracy as much as some people involved in progressive university governance might wish that it were, but it's somewhere in the middle. And so I think the university codes of conduct that create things like the President's Advisory Committee here are very, very important to propose there's a different model than making the cheapest shirts possible without and externalizing all of the costs and impacts onto workers, and then seeing if they can raise enough campaign to fight about it later, right? And to show when there are violations, there must be remedies for those workers. And so I think it's a very important issue that you have going on right now, and the students and faculty and the committee that are raising the issue and urging the university to say, our University of Michigan brand has a value that says that this was made with decent labor conditions, and where it's not, we're going to fix it. I think that's deeply important, and it will have a ripple effect out into other kinds of fast fashion and other kinds of ways. It shows there's a way to do it right, and that's right now, I think, what the University of Michigan is standing for when you stand up for these kinds of cases. In terms of what was the situation in Dindigal and the leverage, I think it was a set of organizations that were working together to support very brave worker organizing that had been happening for some time before the death of Jayshree Ketravel. The work had begun in 2017 and 2018 when workers, when TTCU had participated with other unions across Asia in a study of gender-based violence and harassment in the garment industry, including a spectrum of violence that was developed by the Asia Floor Wage Alliance and researchers through focus groups and published. Based on that, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance developed an organizing methodology called Safe Circles and began having one-on-one conversations with brands about whether the programs that they were running that were simple trainings were sufficient to change that power dynamics along the spectrum of violence. There were then meetings at the ILO. There was a lot of national, regional, global efforts, so that when Jayashree's death occurred, like much of that, those relationships and those architectures were able to be moved to say, we know what this problem is, we know what will solve it, we've told you that, you haven't done it, now we have a crisis and you need to respond. The Guardian published several articles really detailing out what had happened and calling for response. The brands that step forward, I think, are brands that have the reputation in this sector of being more open and more ethical. And so the brands that are part of the Dindigul Agreement right now are Gap, H&M, and a group called PVH, which includes the Calvin Klein and other brands in it. And so I think, it takes leadership among all the many constituencies to reach something like the Dindigul Agreement. It takes leadership of affected women. Without that, you won't have anything. It takes leadership of the union to exist. But it also takes leadership of people within multinational companies to not say like, let's just have a PR response and not a deep response. Let's not just have a 1 month response. Let's have a 3 month response, and let's really study and evaluate it, and let's make the next set of decisions based on that.
Ravi, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so there is an online question from Selva Malar Alagaratnam, if I pronounce this right. Says, good evening, I'm a labor and employer in Malaysia and have been practicing in this area for 30 years. One challenge we face is that trade unions to a large extent have lost their credibility. And what the person means basically is that they've been more focused on raising wages alone and less concerned about working conditions or advancement of workers. So the question really is, do you have any suggestions as to how we can take human rights agenda forward without the involvement of unions or other bodies that are union-like? Over.
I mean, at Global Labor Justice, we believe in what the ILO definition calls worker organizations, which means base organizations of affected workers with a democratic structure. For us, this is fundamental. Sometimes that doesn't have to be unions. Sometimes it's cooperatives. It can be other experimental forms of that. But and that's not to say that there's not other important rights producing activities besides that, right? Like legal cases can get a remedy for people. Passing good legislation that will then hopefully change behavior is important. But we think that worker organizations themselves, with a broad and expansive understanding of work and community, are a critical component of that. I think it's the union movement is the percentages are low enough that it means they're not in every workplace, in every city, in every community. Although, and almost, I would say in any workplace I've ever been in, there are workers that are understanding the problem and wanting to collectivize and do something. So I think part of the issue is building support and capacity and research and analysis for the labor movement as well, building ways for the leadership of affected people. Many trade unions have traditionally not had strong women's leadership, for example, and so making space where that can grow and using the capacity that we have to support that.
Okay, so we have time for another round of questions from the room. I think I saw one here in the second row. And then is there another one? Okay, great. And then it looks like we can take three. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, hi, thank you for your talk. So a question I have was about one of the videos mentioned kind of like how companies sometimes offer places for the workers to live. So kind of like how this overlap functions, like in your experience in global labor justice or like other organizations like the ILO, how do these organizations promote safety when workers are out of the workplace, but still like under the jurisdiction of companies, like be it like living, eating, just like freedom in general? Like how, if you have like any sort of experience in that, how are these components of their lives affected by their company's policies?
Right back there and there. Yep.
I was curious about what you think about the role of the consumer in the fight for labor rights. In your experiences, are boycotts effective, or do they actually end up hurting workers? And also, what would you like to see in terms of like educational resources for consumers, whether it's supply chain transparency policies or things along those lines?
Yeah, I was going to ask, I guess, yeah, kind of along, I think kind of similar question to like what we like in the United States can do, but more kind of, I'm more focused on kind of like what workers in the United States, so like what can workers in the United States and the American labor movement sort of learn from these labor fights kind of internationally, as well as what can like workers do in America to contribute to these sort of international labor fights?
That's a great question. I'm going to maybe try to go in reverse. They're all great questions. I think that, the global labor solidarity is hugely important. And from the perspective of mutual skin in the game, I don't think it's not a charity for U.S. workers and Asian workers to be in solidarity. And the question is, what is the business model and how is it affecting everyone? And so we know, that the traditional way of thinking about supply chains is the workers that make the clothes and the workers that ship the clothes and the workers in the warehouse and the workers in the store will all strike on the same day and disrupt everything. And that'd be great. If that happened, a lot of things would change. I think there's more ways than just that to think about mutual solidarity and mutual interest. And so we've done some work around a model of headquarter cities. And so looking at, okay, where are the headquarters of multinational companies in the United States? And what are the unions that are there that might have common cause, the workers cleaning those buildings of the headquarters of the, may have an interest or may have some leverage in addition to the workers making the clothes. I also think, when we start thinking seriously about equity and what are the choices a company like Nike is making, Nike makes a lot of choices about which sports to invest in, which, whether it's women's sports, whether it's like the major leagues versus the minor leagues, these sorts of questions. And so there may be interesting fights going on. There's a lot of organizing going on for sports, for athletes. I almost said sports workers, you can tell. Among athletes, because much like we saw during the Actors Guild strikes, the fact that you're an actor or an athlete doesn't mean you're one of the very few that's making all the big bucks. And so starting to look at the structure of those industries and the political economy around them creates really different openings. I think the stock buybacks and looking at how money is being extracted from these companies is something that cuts across sector. And so the supply chain workers in garment have had common cause with railway workers, with tech workers, and with call center workers around the stock buybacks. Those have been some of the U.S. unions that have lined up, the CWA, the SEIU, others. And so I think we've been trying to think both like ways that traditional sectors line up, also ways that corporate greed is harming everyone. And I think that's where it's been great to bring supply chain workers in, because it's not, oh, these poor workers, like, let's help them. It's, when Nike does, whether it's Nike or Verizon or Apple doing massive stock buybacks, we can see the consequences for workers, and we need to stop it when we're all in the same fight. Okay, so let me go to the housing. So the ILO has a definition called the world of work. And definitions that are adopted or mainstreamed at the ILO, it means that not only workers agree with them, but in every country, but governments in every country and employers in every country agree with them. This is what the ILO does every year, is get together and develop these in a fulsome way. For those of you that are coming from the traditional human rights frame, I would encourage you to get some exposure to the ILO and see how it works. It's really, really interesting and different than the UN mechanisms in that way. So the world of work is a much more fulsome definition than what you might think of as your workplace. It includes oftentimes the places around your work, like where you're eating lunch, if you're on company transportation, if you're in hostels, because we know that fundamentally company-provided housing is oftentimes heavily surveilled and is a way that and can be used in a retaliatory way. If you lose your job, it's very bad. If you lose your job and your housing at the same time, you can be put in an even more extreme crisis. If you're in your housing and your housing mates are threatened for something you did, so it's not just you losing your housing and your job, it's potentially the people you share the room with, the pressure can get very extreme very fast. And so making sure that whether it's people who get housing because they're migrants or people who are in housing because they're working at a university, all the different ways that housing and work is tied. I think understanding that as a labor issue is really, really important, and more folks are thinking about and asking those questions. So the question of consumers, I think that the understanding of what is a labor market, what is a consumer market, how do we think about these things, I think it's in an imaginative space. And so traditionally, you have campaigns like the Coalition for Immokalee Workers and the Fair Food Program, which is talked about as a consumer campaign, but had a lot of students involved. It had a lot of progressive religious people involved. Partly it was about, saying I'm willing to pay more for this thing if it includes labor rights, but a lot of it was about brand reputation as well. I think that connects back to the earlier question about the University of Michigan, and is its university apparel going to be made in substandard working conditions. So I think when you start to think about consumers as collectives that can influence the brands, I think that continues to be important, but it's maybe more creative and innovative than some of the traditional petitions or other ways that has happened.
We have time for a few. Oh, you want to?
I was just going to say one more thing on boycotts. Sorry, I didn't mention that. I think boycotts are, in our opinion at Global Labor Justice, boycotts have to be called by the workers who would lose their jobs or lose their livelihoods if those boycotts were called. And if workers are in such a situation that is so extreme that they do that, we honor that. We show up with solidarity. We show up with strike funds if we can. We recognize, much like forced migration, that to be in such a position where you would put yourself and your colleagues at such a risk, it must be very extreme. We don't call for boycotts ourselves on our own behalf in any situation. That's when you get to the question of what are the decisions that have to be made fundamentally by democratic worker organizations through a structure versus ally organizations. That's a really important one.
A few more questions from the floor. One here. Okay, one there, and maybe one back there as well. See if we can do 3 more. So the 2 in the front and 1 in the back. The microphone. Yep.
Hi, I'm curious about strategies for organizing in countries where the government is repressive against workers. I saw on the Global Labor Justice website, you guys have a section on Uyghur forced labor in China. And so how do you organize when the problem isn't even recognized?
Can you pass it?
I was wondering, I know that the organization that you work with and others, these ally organizations or NGOs that are working with unions and also working with the ILO or other governmental organizations, you do a lot of different and diffuse kinds of things, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kind of support you offer and what kind of resources you have that allow you to offer that support.
And maybe we can pass it back there, but if you want to start on the first 2. Yeah.
At Global Labor Justice, we consider ourselves a labor support organization. Our theory is that the global economy is structured in a different way than it maybe it's been creeping there along the way for a long time, but that many laws and organizations are structured at the national level, and we need different kinds of research and different kinds of capacity to advocate and different kinds of movement relationships to be effective, that will inform new strategy. We operate on 4 pillars of change, so we think about fundamentally worker organizing and worker organization and moving affected people from the margins to the center of their organizations. So that means are more people joining unions, or more unions joining confederations or global union federations, or more women or migrants in leadership in sectors where they're the predominant workforce. The second is movement, law, and policy. So we think like, how do we use all these legal and policy tools that we have to fundamentally drive worker power solutions? Because right now we don't think we have enough power to get what people deserve. You know, it's good to enforce the minimum wage, but we need to have much higher living wages. So that's we're not saying this is what everybody should be doing. This is what we're doing. The third is transformative coalitions, new kinds of alignments and partnerships. So who do worker organizations need to be working with to build the world we want to have? What does that mean about climate? What does that mean about women's organizations and migrant organizations? Again, in long term, we can change each other, transformative sorts of ways. And then the final one, we call it new forms of bargaining. This is a phrase taken from a book called The Future We Need by Erica Smiley and Sarita Gupta, who've written about racial capitalism and bargaining for the common good, and some of the fights, for example, around the Chicago's teachers union, where teachers were fighting to improve their conditions as teachers, but also improve conditions in the schools for kids. And so union bargaining fights can go expansively much more beyond wages to what are the working conditions, what are the community conditions. The TTCU could bargain for not just better transportation between work and home, but different ways that people could get transportation for their kids to go to school. Like these things are totally possible. It's a question of power. And so again, regulation is important. Regulation creates an enabling environment for these things to happen. But power pushes back. Like these are long-term struggles, and we think community and worker organizations have to hold power accountable over time in democratic forms. So that's the strategies that we use. On our team, we have people with organizing backgrounds. We have people with communications backgrounds. We have people with legal backgrounds, legal and policy. We have people with research backgrounds. And part of what we do is show up and say, like, okay, what's going on? Like, what do you know? What do you need to know? Like, what could we do here that would be helpful? We work like very deeply collaboratively. So in the negotiations around the Dindigul Agreement with the multinational fashion brands, the union leaders were in the negotiations. We would prepare them, we would hold them, we would debrief them. We would hold them at a time that was okay for them to be there, and we would make the corporate executives and the NGO people all like be on the call at 11 o'clock at night, if that's what it means here. And so we definitely, for us in our work, the outcome that we want is, first of all, that workers' lives are getting better day by day. Even if we're not winning the big thing, it took us 2 years to win the Dindigul Agreement, but people should get some things along the way, which often happens right as concessions. We don't just want to make a point. We want people's day-to-day lives to be better. Secondly, we want the union organizations to be strengthened, partially in the way that they define themselves, so that they can do their work going forward. We don't want to we might have a long-term partnership, but we don't want to have a dependency problem where we can only do certain things and the unions can't. If they want to learn to do the research themselves, we want to set it up that way. If they want to hire a lawyer in their own union, we want to help them find the right people and figure out how to do that. And then finally, that the fights we're having around how to have leverage and ultimately new forms of bargaining in the global economy, that we're learning things that are more expansive than this particular fight. We're building models and templates. And so the garment sector, is one of the most easy to move, right? You can have garments being made in Bangladesh today on, is it Tuesday? Tuesday, and by next Tuesday, you could have that order happening in Sri Lanka. That's a little bit harder with electronics and auto parts, but that's the vision, right? That's the dream of many companies. And so if we can learn how to respond here, we can, that can expand out to different kinds of supply chains. Similarly, we do work with deep sea migrant fishers, and a lot of that is around the migration status questions. If we can learn how to protect fishers that are out at sea for 12 months at a time from the kind of retaliation of living on your boat and being a contingent migrant worker, like that has a lot of, there's a lot of learnings for a lot of other sectors as well. I feel like there was another question.
Do you want to mention China?
Oh, I mean, this is a very, there are layers of open and closed to organizing societies and labor and layers of kinds of repression. I think workers themselves, I have never seen a situation where workers themselves were not in some kind of resistance mode, but the structure that takes is very contextual. Sometimes, and the role that we play is different in different campaigns. And so sometimes we are in coalition with diaspora groups for a time to try to change the enabling environment. So a good example of this is the cotton campaign in Uzbekistan. Much of the cotton that goes into some of the home goods that you all have is from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Hopefully it's not as much from there as right now. But so there was a campaign, workers could not organize. There were, in fact, the majority of the workers were public sector teachers and doctors that were pulled from their jobs by the state to harvest the cotton. The goal of that campaign was that worker organizing is very minimally possible in this environment with so much retaliation. So what we need to do is get the US and European brands to say we won't go in until there's a different environment. We will not buy this cotton, and to hold that line with the pledge, which we did for some time, which did allow some opening and some additional civil society registrations. These are sort of long-term projects. So saying like the general model doesn't mean that there's not very specific, complicated situations. But it's not only in the Uyghur region in China. In Myanmar right now, workers are organizing. Much of it is underground and has to be done by people and across borders. But it's happening, and global campaigns need to be attentive to fundamentally that, like how to enable it to happen more, is my opinion.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but hopefully there's time to come and chat afterwards. I know we'll all stay for a bit, but let's thank JJ Rosenbaum for a really engaging talk.
Yeah, JJ, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights with the community. Really appreciate that, and hope you and I will have an opportunity to meet sometime in DC. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it's been great, Ravi. It's almost like you're here, but I know it would be better.
It's like Stephen Hawking style kind of thing, we kind of go on a monitor somewhere.
I look forward to meeting you in person. Maybe next time the FLA is in DC, we can get together there.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.